Today's speaker is Dr. Victoria Leslie. She's working with one of those funded projects called Diverse Marine Values, where a range of arts-based research methods is used to implement diverse values into decision-making. It's a very interesting project, and I will put a link to that in the chat a bit later. Victoria is currently a research fellow at the University of Portsmouth. She's an English literature and creative writing scholar, the author of a short story collection and a novel, and the recipient of 2 literary fellowships and a finalist for a number of international fiction prizes. So very happy to have her here today to talk about this topic of storytelling and climate research.
So yeah, the aim of this talk is to try and bring together some of the ideas I've been exploring for a while now, and to try and give them a bit of semblance. I'm going to be talking for about 25 to 30 minutes, depending on how quickly I get through some of these ideas. And then there's going to be some dedicated time for us to just have a bit of a discussion afterwards to think about the role of storytelling and climate research, and also maybe drawing upon some of your experiences of using stories as well. So I can start by saying that the content of this webinar emerged from a joint workshop which was held at last year's SMMR annual conference, which is in collaboration with Diverse Marine Values, of which I'm a part, as Chrissy's already explained, and Co-opt. And that was to explore climate change research and storytelling. Since then, our collaboration has become a bit more formalised in the form of a 4th-year unit of research, which is based on communicating climate change information. Part of what we will be examining, great, thank you. Part of what we'll be examining is how a narrative can build upon and enhance scientific research focused on coastal futures, and in turn, how the literary landscape is informed by climate science. Will Storr, in The Science of Storytelling, writes that we experience our day-to-day lives in story mode. The brain creates a world for us to live in, which is populated by allies and villains, where narrative is conjured to give shape to chaos and disorder, and where each of us is the protagonist of our own story. As the protagonist of my own story and the narrator of this particular one, I should introduce myself, although Chrissy's done an amazing job already. I'm a research fellow on the Diverse Marine Values project, as has already been mentioned. My background is in English literature and creative writing, and I also write fiction and non-fiction as well. A lot of my stories are governed by environmental sensibilities, and in particular, a lot of my stories have been very driven to explore water and the cultural associations of water, which is why I find myself now on the Diverse Marine Values project, exploring marine values from a kind of cultural perspective. I was thinking that if this paper were a story, it might be a quest, an endeavour to draw together research on climate futures and fictions, narratology and climate science. But to what end? Quest narratives are goal-oriented. They compel the protagonist to overcome a series of obstacles. In this light, I could be the plucky hero researcher trying to understand more about the relationship between climate research and storytelling. The aim of this particular endeavour, to explore how writers and scientists respond to climate change and anticipate and imagine climate futures, is arguably hampered by disciplinary territorialization and systemic parameters which privilege certain forms of evidence over others. These might be some of the obstacles that we could consider to be blocking the quest. And to put simply, quantitative evidence, including narrative evidence, is I suppose subservient to some other forms. It can be seen as subservient as other forms of evidence, which is valued slightly more. I'm going to be talking in a bit about making a case for the inclusion of storytelling and stories as another form of evidence for decision makers a bit later on. But quests are also about embarking upon physical or metaphorical journeys. And I should say that trying to carve a pathway through the maze of literature on narrative models, templates, and techniques has certainly been my first challenge. So I wanted to draw upon Joseph Campbell's Hero with 1,000 Faces. It's a well-worn template for how to organise a story from 1949, and I think this is my first slide. Campbell uses the term monomyth to refer to the narrative pattern specific to a hero's quest, a universal pattern he found congruent in narratives the world over. Departure, initiation, and return, the three-part act, mark the stages of a protagonist's journey, a journey that, thanks to an abbreviated version of Campbell's book, could be mapped and followed, becoming a blueprint for 20th century writers and filmmakers. And if it's okay to go to the next slide. There's great. So you can see, you probably recognize this template in lots of the stories that you read and lots of the TV series or films that you watch. It's about starting a journey, about there being an adventure or obstacles to overcome in the way, on the way, and then returning back again. But Campbell's approach is just one of many which provide a roadmap to constructing stories. And we can also look at this roadmap to deconstruct stories and to analyze them as well. And there are countless different narrative models and step-by-step guides you could look at in order to construct stories. Talking about the Hero with 1,000 Faces and quest narratives, I just wanted to highlight Maria Tatar's work, The Heroine with 1,001 Faces. Campbell's work takes quite a gendered view of the hero's quest. And Maria Tatar's book, it was only published a year ago, I think, a couple of years ago, is a really welcome addition to this corpus, which provides examples of female heroism in myth and culture, and tracks the similar kind of journey quest that these protagonists go on. So in pulling together some of the ideas for today's talk, I've had to pass by or omit certain theories and approaches I would have liked to explore in more detail, just in order to keep to the time and to make this a little bit more manageable. So in particular, I'm not going to be focusing today on the power of stories, on their persuasive or didactic function, and how they convey messages, and therefore how they can be used to promote particular points of view. I think that's a topic for another talk altogether. So today, what I'm going to be looking at in particular is to explore some of the reasons why we tell stories, and how we tell stories about the future. We are all imbibers of story. This is a term that Sarah Dillon and Claire Craig have coined, the way we consume literature, film, stories and anecdotes and other kinds of forms. And we're all kind of familiar with patterns of narrative. They're there in how we organize information, how we write reports, articles, how we tell anecdotes or jokes. So we're actually very adept storytellers in the way we communicate in everyday contexts. And as the protagonist, to return to the quest narrative of your own story on your own quest, I'd like you to have in the back of your mind what your particular goal is in thinking about storytelling as a means to enhance your own perspectives or research. It might be that you're here just for curiosity, or it might be that you have some engagement with storytelling in other contexts. So it would be really interesting when we get to the conversation a bit later on to hear about that. So to begin with, why do we tell stories? So given that our project, Co-ops and Diverse Marine Values focus is on coastal values and watery spaces, it seems apt to begin with a quote from a novel which is concerned with flooded landscapes and which is also preoccupied with telling stories. So is it okay to go to the next slide, please? Graham Swift writes in Waterland, "Man is the storytelling animal. Wherever he goes, he wants to leave behind not a chaotic wake, not an empty space, but the comforting marker buoys and trail signs of stories. He has to go on telling stories. He has to keep on making them up. As long as there's a story, it's all right. Even in his last moments, it's said, in the split second of a fatal fall, or when he's about to drown, he sees passing rapidly before him the story of his whole life. Within Swift's imagery of marker buoys and trail signs of stories, we could see this as functioning as a way to chart a route or a pathway through life. Interestingly, these signposts or markers seem to be assigned in retrospect as a way of deriving meaning after the wake of lived experience. A similar sentiment is expressed by William Cronon in his essay, A Place for Stories. It is a human impetus to tell stories. It helps us to understand and chronicle human experience. I think this is on the next slide. Narrative is fundamental to the way we humans organize our experience. Whatever may be the perspective of the universe on the things going on around us, our human perspective is that we inhabit an endlessly storied world. We narrate the triumphs and failures of our pasts. We tell stories to explore the alternative choices that might lead to feared or hoped for futures. Our very habit of partitioning the flow of time into events and their implied beginnings, middles, and ends suggests how deeply the narrative structure is in our experience of the world. For Cronon, stories provide a way to partition time, to order events with a clearly defined beginning, middle, and end, kind of basic structure of a story, and allow us to find meaning in an overwhelmingly crowded and disordered chronological reality. We can see similar events-based features in climate storylines, which are gaining currency as an alternative approach for charting trends or for depicting future scenarios. Acknowledging inherent limitations within climate modelling, Theodore Shepard and his colleagues championed storylines as an alternative way to represent uncertainties in physical aspects of climate change, which have been more typically depicted by climate model simulations. Rather than the emphasis being on quantifying probabilities, the use of storylines, narratives, or tales, which they collectively refer to as storylines, developed descriptive narrativization of plausible future climates. They define storylines as physically self-consistent unfolding of past events or of plausible future events or pathways, with a focus on understanding the driving factors involved and the plausibility of those factors. Is it okay to go to the next slide? Shepard et al. Also highlight two human traits which have a bearing on how we think about risk. They allude to Endel Telving's research on memory, making the distinction between knowing facts, which they classify as semantic, versus reliving events, classified as episodic. They argue that storyline approaches are episodic, while conventional approaches to climate change risks are semantic, as in this example. So a risk conveyed semantically might be what is a 1 in 1,000-year event, whereas a risk conveyed episodically is, have we seen this before? And if so, what might the next event be like? So the obvious difference here in these examples is that the episodic is seen through an anthropocentric lens. It is impacted by our lived experience. Research within behavioral psychology point to our inability to comprehend risks which exist outside of our realm of experience. Memory is therefore incredibly important as a means of preparedness. As Shepard et al. State, constructive memory and episodic future simulation can act as warning bells to enable us to conceive of possible extreme phenomena. So what's coming clear here is that looking back, and this familiarity of looking back, is fundamental. It's a mechanism in anticipating future change. So we can think about many of the reasons why we tell stories, and I'm only covering a couple today, but one of them is that we can assign meaning to chaos and disorder, like the marker buoys which guide a vessel out at sea, They allow us to create past events and even future ones. And they help us to organize and order events and episodes, and in the process, they give them meaning. As we've seen, climate storylines are not concerned solely with future looking. They can also be about the unfolding of past events. And often looking back, as we've just seen now, is an important function in how we anticipate and model future orientation. But how do we tell stories about the future? The terminology abounds. We have futures, foresights, forecasting, prediction, anticipation, prospection, and speculation. And I just wanted to focus for a moment on the term speculation, which is quite important in the realms of literature. Within literature, speculation is an umbrella term which encompasses a range of genres, including science fiction and fantasy, which often explore possible and distant futures. And this also includes cli-fi or climate fiction, which can be defined as mainstream literature with a more overt focus on climate sensibilities. But for some researchers and readers, the distance from science, they find the distance from science fiction problematic. But I think it's worth pausing for a moment to look at the etymology of the term speculation and how that relates to future looking and to imagining future scenarios. So as Hetty Saunders and Joss Smith write in their introduction to speculative nature writing and anthology, speculation can be an imaginative wager or an empirical calculation. It can be a daydream or an intense foreboding, a weighing up and trying out, a rehearsal of possible paths ahead. Is it okay to go to the next slide? They go on that the meaning of speculation has developed in fascinating ways over the centuries. Its first sense comes from its Latin roots in something related to sight or vision, to closely observe, to look at or view, and it's related to spectate, spectacles, or even spectra, a strange or supernatural sight. In the 17th century, it suggested a view from a tower or a vantage point, as in the final book of Milton's epic poem, Paradise Lost, when the archangel Michael instructs Adam to take his leave from paradise. Let us ascend now, therefore, from this top of speculation. And historically, a speculator might have been a spy, a lookout, or even an explorer. And from this physical sense comes its secondary meanings, those relating to contemplation and conjecture. Samuel Johnson's definition of speculation in his famous dictionary was concerned with taking a mental view. To speculate, as Johnson put it, was to consider attentively, to look through with the mind. In this attentive mental looking, we can recognize something of today's meaning of speculation, or for a more familiar sense of future looking. This notion of intensely looking, of possessing an overview from a vantage point and through close observation, are traits shared by scientists and writers in how they explore climate fiction and climate change and climate futures. The role of speculative fiction is not really to predict the future, but to offer possible pathways to explore the future. Saunders and Smith highlight the psychological benefits for decision-making in simulating possible futures in narratives. By visualizing specific future events, we can actually behave differently, more prudently than we might do otherwise. Sarah Dillon and Claire Craig, in their text Story Listening, Narrative Evidence and Public Reasoning, prefer the term anticipation in relation to future looking. They posit that the role of stories in anticipation is of fundamental importance to public reasoning, because all decision-making depends on how the future is imagined and what futures are imagined, despite the fact that the future can never be known. They argue that stories can function as anticipatory narrative models, and that story listening, which they define as the theory and practice of gathering narrative evidence, can enhance the quality of current decisions by bridging from imagined future scenarios to present action. So they define narrative evidence as the product of the expert act of both direct critical engagement with stories and with others critical engagement with reading, viewing, or listening to stories, which they term story imbibing. And this is on the next slide. And I think this is a really interesting way that we imbibe stories. They kind of we take them in, and they argue cogently that stories should be taken seriously as part of a pluralistic evidence base for decision makers, and they promote narrative literacy as a means to better understand the function of stories. I really recommend this text if you haven't come across it before. It's very erudite and makes some really compelling arguments for the inclusion of storytelling to enhance the kind of basis of information that decision makers can use. With regard to anticipation, which is their preferred term for future looking, they note that future-oriented stories can be divided into two categories: those about end states and those about pathways, risks, and adaptations.
What was that?
Oh, sorry. We are saturated with stories about end states. There are many examples of literary speculations that begin at the end after various forms of disasters or catastrophes. You might consider a novel like Cormac McCarthy's The Road, which begins after some cataclysmic event, we don't know what it is, and it's about that period of existing afterwards. Or we could consider a text like Kim Stanley Robinson 2140, New York 2140, which imagines New York inundated by floods and people betting on, or people hedging or kind of corporate finance taking advantage of people's dire situations. There's still economic gain to be made in this collapsing world. But there are also narratives which explore pathways. Both Richard Powers' recent novels could be seen as offering us different ways to think about pathways of climate change. In the Overstory, there's multiple narrative viewpoints which mirror the branching of a tree and explore individual journeys of characters who are on their own trajectory to preventing climate collapse. They're all kind of fighting their own battles with this huge nebulous idea of the collapse of climate. Whereas in Bewilderment, the story charts the journey of a child oversaturated with this kind of information about the planet's impending doom, and explores the pathways of action and activism. So on the next slide, there's a few examples of texts which explore in various ways, explore either end states or, as I mentioned, Overstory, Richard Powers' novel there, which explore pathways. And I found this really helpful in trying to think about novels that imagine, or stories that imagine the future, trying to think about this distinction between whether it's a world in the future that's already been impacted, or whether it's about pathways towards that can then be altered or unpicked or readdressed in some kind of way. And I also wanted to highlight the work of the academic Mike Bald as well, who in The Anthropocene Unconscious explores, kind of talks about the idea that we're living in an age where there's obviously overt examples of climate fiction, but also that most texts, most literature and art is also saturated with this idea of climate change. And then it's just about us looking a bit more deeply into that to unpick some of these sensibilities that are there within the work. And narrative literacy, to return to the idea of Dylan and Craig, might be one way that we can do that. So to conclude, to kind of bring all this together, I realize it's a lot of different ideas, really, kind of focused a bit on why we tell stories to some degree, and also to think a little bit about the way we present futures, and some of the justifications for why we might want to do that from a decision-making context. But to conclude, the realms of speculation and anticipation are fertile ground for scientists and writers alike. And we can also note that there's lots of similarities in our purpose and methods. As we've seen, narrative can help organize and shape events, experiences and action, and in the process, by doing so, they assign meaning to that process. Stories can also help us to anticipate the future and speculate and imagine what it might be like. And this process can be grounded in familiarity, in memory or the approximation of it, looking back to look forwards, and can serve as a means of preparedness. I think in writing this, I've been thinking about the fact that the future isn't fixed. There are multiple pathways ahead. The paths for us to take as actors in the world and as protagonists in our own stories. We could return to the idea of this quest narrative, which seems to be a fitting template or analogy for our collective journey we are undertaking in this community, at least, and to reflect on some of the challenging questions and actions we have set ourselves in our line of research and within some of the projects within SMMR. Narrative as a journey transports us figuratively and perhaps literally into new territory. And I was thinking about myself, beginning of my academic career, I don't think I imagined working in marine management, but I think through working in interdisciplinary research, I've entered new territory, and I've been very enriched through that process. As Will Storr writes, transportation changes people, and then it changes the world. The stories we imbibe and tell, they have the ability to take us to new places, to new futures, and we can arrive at these end states and work our way back, or we can start at the beginning from the ground up. But in doing so, I think this has the potential to change how we engage with the world, and some of the ways that we might do that. So that's it for a kind of a walkthrough of some of the ideas of I've been looking at in terms of storytelling. I've mentioned a few texts in this as well. It'd be really great to hear from people on the call today what texts you might be looking at, and how maybe storytelling has influenced your research and work, and just really to have a bit more of a conversation about the function of stories, and also the way stories can help us imagine futures. Okay. So,
thank you very much, Victoria. That was a really nice presentation. I absolutely love that you mentioned about the storyline of your interdisciplinary career, let's say it like that. And there's this, that it can help just to bridge between different disciplines or life stages as well. Thank you very much for that. Very glad to open up a discussion. If someone has a question, please feel free to just unmute yourself or write in the chat or raise a hand. I can see Maria. Please, the floor is yours.
Hello. Thank you so much for the presentation. It was actually so insightful and useful, especially for my research. I was very curious. Basically, I'm building VR climate simulations to try to make climate change more concrete and visualize the future. And you mentioned at some point that there's two types of stories, which were about end states or about pathways. And I was just curious if there's any research into which one is more effective for changing behavior. Thanks.
Yeah, that's your research sounds super interesting as well, actually, as I'm really keen to, this is the area of research I don't understand as much about, and I'm really keen to understand more about how you do what you do. I should just I would recommend definitely Dylan and Craig's book Story Listening, and they talk about end states actually being sometimes kind of counterproductive, because pathways give us this optimism that we can have an impact and we can change things, whereas end states kind of, there's this assumption that we already in whatever's happened has already happened and it's too late really. though there can be, value in exploring the narratives that are in that particular world as well. So I think in terms of behavioural, I'm pretty sure from the text that they talk about pathways, particularly being more useful for that. But I'll have another look through the text, see if I can find out any specific research that they might have drawn upon.
I'll definitely read it myself as well. It looks very good. Cool. Thank you so much.
No worries.
Thank you very much. Yeah, it's quite interesting to hear about other people's jobs as well. Just the areas of research, things I never knew existed, but just brilliant. Yes, please just also feel free to leave a comment in the chat if you prefer that. Be happy to read that aloud. Something that I actually thought about was when you mentioned climate fiction, and that sometimes it can be a struggle, that it is too close to science fiction, as in, how do you see that whole area? Is it a tool that can be used, or is it something that's a bit too dangerous in terms of what is being conveyed?
Yeah, but I think that's a really interesting question. And to return to the Dylan and Craig's book on story listening, they actually open the whole text with a reading of Terminator, which is really great because it's such an iconic reference point for us all about, the danger of machine of AI systems and cognizant machines in the future, and the impact to us. And I think that there is this fear sometimes that science fiction and climate fiction can throw us into this territory of like fear mongering. But actually what they argue in the text is that it's by exploring some of these scenarios, or even if they might seem a bit far-fetched, or if they might not reflect a reality in the present, there's actually still value in going through that exercise. It might be that it's actually reflecting anxieties of people in society, and that in itself has value. So there's always I think a value to including some of these narratives. And in terms of the relationship between climate fiction and science fiction is often seen as not being like literary, whereas climate fiction is seen to be a bit more mainstream. So I think some researchers would regard climate fiction as essentially being science fiction, but that it's kind of pulling itself away a little bit to maintain that kind of literary kind of elevation potentially. So, which is why there's this distinction.
Well, thank you. Very interesting. We have a question from Anjali.
Hi. So I work in science communications now, but my background and my doctorate is in English literature. So I'd love to throw a really literary question, as opposed to a science question. I'd throw a kind of literary one to you, which is that when you shared that passage about speculation and its Latin roots, I was quite surprised that that didn't draw out the other part of that kind of etymology from speculum for mirror. And I would just really love to hear you unpack speculation as mirroring as opposed to forward looking, or the aspects of mirroring involved in forward looking. So I know that's so literary, but like I've loved this talk because it's just been really nourishing for my soul as someone who's not a scientist and is working on science. It's been so wonderful to hear how literature is just so powerful in communicating it. So thank you.
Thank you, Anjali. That's really great. And it's great to have another English literature person involved in this area of research too. So that's really great. Yeah, it's interesting. So I was kind of, when I was looking at at speculate, I suppose I was kind of looking more at the forward-looking aspects of speculate, and I hadn't really considered the mirror aspect of that. But actually, it does strike me that obviously mimesis, this you know, the way we kind of mirror reality is another kind of form of a way we consolidate our idea about the natural world. And I can't remember the exact instance right now, but I was reading only about it this morning about Aristotelian mimesis versus kind of the future looking. I can't articulate it very well at all today, but I will follow up with you if that's okay, because it was something that I was also kind of struck with. And at the time, I just put it aside to focus on the further gaze. But actually, when thinking about how there has to be a kind of familiarity in some of the futures that we're kind of we're creating, and that has to come from a basis in reality. Otherwise, it wouldn't kind of resonate with us. So I think mimesis is a really important component, which I haven't explored in much detail in this talk today. But yeah, I would love to follow up with you on a literary topic, if that's okay. Great.
Thank you for that question. Very nice. And yes, I think seeing also the interdisciplinary bridge with English literature and sciences and marine management is always very nice to hear. And I think increasing more and more. I just posted a link in the chat on the Diverse Marine Values Project. Please feel free to just have a read. And I will also post a link to the events calendar for upcoming webinars, which I mentioned at the beginning. Yeah, so feel free to have a look in there as well. Any other questions so far? It's already been a very, very interesting discussion.
I was just going to ask if, following this discussion, if I'm trying to build a bit of a repository of stories that confront the future, and there's a lot of climate fiction out there at the moment. And as Mark Bald, if you happen to read his text on the Anthropocene unconscious, a lot of text, but it's there kind of under the surface as well. So yeah, if you wanted to share any texts, that would be really great. And I would also just like to point you out, direct you to the Marine Social Science Network, which has a wonderful book club as well, which if you want to join a book club with marine issues at the heart, I would definitely recommend having a look at MARSOC Network and seeing what books they've got coming up to discuss.